Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
In 1982, the Yale Law School professor Robert Cover published an article in the Harvard Law Review that has inspired jurists and legal scholars ever since. Entitled Nomos and Narrative, the work interrogates the ways in which legal systems are intertwined with collective stories and demonstrates how our laws come out of epic narratives we tell ourselves about who we are as a group. Now, don't get the wrong idea. I don't normally read legal journals. I guess that's obvious. But Nomos and Narrative is a text that has become as essential to rabbinic education as it is to law school curricula, in part because Professor Cover uses so many Jewish texts to craft his argument. His footnotes are as filled with rabbinic references as they are American history and law. And his teaching is uniquely instructive for us as American Jews to understand the differing legal frameworks in which we live. He writes, "No set of legal institutions or prescriptions exists apart from the narratives that locate it and give it meaning. For every constitution, there is an epic. For each decalogue, a scripture." In the case of our Constitution, we tell a story of citizens coming together to establish a democracy based on Enlightenment ideals after declaring independence from the absolute power of a king. And thus, our legal system was born. In the case of our Decalogue, our 10 Commandments, which we read in last week's Parsha, we received those laws after the narrative about the Israelites being freed from slavery so that they could live as a nation under God and not under Pharaoh. Among the many reasons why Jews have flourished in America is the fact that these two stories and the ethical norms that they establish dovetail so neatly with one another. And these days, as many of us are thinking anew about the Constitution, with executive orders and government shakeups that many believe are bumping up against constitutional norms and values, I found myself reading this week's Torah portion, which, as I said, is kind of like a mini constitution, with an eye toward the story that it comes from. In Parshat Mishpatim, we read the continuation of receiving commandments after the much more famous 10 last week. And we see the ways in which the Israelites' story of fleeing degradation informs the laws that they receive. It starts out with a twist. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, we read, that person shall serve 6 years and go free in the 7th. You might think that they would have abolished slavery altogether after enduring the trauma of bondage in Egypt, but this is still an ancient legal code. And what follows are the ways in which the Torah attempts to temper the severity of slavery, given its own narrative of Egyptian persecution. The Eitz Chaim Torah commentary puts it this way: "It would seem that the Israelites, newly freed from Egypt, could not imagine a society without slavery any more than Plato or Aristotle could. But over the course of time, a more humane view of the slave evolved. Though it falls short of how modern readers would understand the immorality of enslaving people, the Torah attempts to create a framework that emphasizes human dignity nonetheless, rooted in its own understanding of pain." In general, that's how Parshat Mishpatim goes, with its lengthy list of laws known by scholars as the Covenant Code, in which we get, as I said before, 53 different laws, many of which deal with the court system, in addition to personal injury, property rights, and matters of social justice, all of which come out of a story of a new covenant. That is, a relationship to God and not to a despotic ruler. And it's in that case, or rather in that context, that I want to focus on one specific set of mitzvot that clearly come out of the Exodus narrative, precisely because I think that they might inform our own decisions of how we approach this moment in our country's history. In Exodus 22:21, we read a classic ethical mitzvah, Kol almana v'yatom lo te'anun. You shall not mistreat a widow or an orphan. This immediately follows a much more familiar commandment, paraphrased 36 times in the Torah, which we also referenced earlier today. Veger lo toneh, you shall not oppress a foreigner, for you are foreigners in the land of Egypt. That last phrase is nomos, a narrative par excellence. And to get really granular for a moment, notice the difference between lo toneh and lo te'anun, the same verb conjugated differently. Toneh in the singular, you, and te'anun with the plural. It continues. Im ana te'aneh oto, if you do mistreat them, again, back to the singular, I will hear their cry as soon as they cry out to me. And then, finally, a dramatic flourish in the final verse of the section. My wrath shall burn, and I will kill you with a sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless. Never mind for a moment the harshness of God's decree. This final verse employs two literary mic drops. It says that if you afflict a widow or an orphan, then you can expect your own loved ones to one day become widows and orphans. And also, it returns us to the second person plural. V'haragti etchem, I will kill you all. Referring also to nishechem, your wives, ubneichem, and all of your children. It's pretty brutal. And the point is clear. We must be very careful not to harm a widow or an orphan, the biblical idiom for anyone who is powerless. No surprise then that a stranger or a foreigner also is often included in that list. And as for the back and forth between singular and plural, we might not notice it right away, but the 12th century Abraham ibn Ezra insisted that this discrepancy in nominal declension is telling us something important. He writes, the text first states, you shall not afflict in the plural, and then switch to, if thou afflict him in the singular. We take this to mean that whoever sees a person afflicting an orphan or widow and does not help them, he is also accounted as an afflictor. This is a consistent refrain in Jewish teachings, that if you witness a crime but do not protest, you are counted as an accessory to injustice. And it is often paired with a memory of our past. Ibn Ezra continues, the reason that the conclusion of the thought appears in the plural is that the punishment given when one is guilty of afflicting and no one intervenes applies to all, meaning all of society. And for this reason, the text says, I will kill you in the plural, meaning all of you. It's really intense, this commentary, examining a grammatical quirk and expanding it as a conditional that if you don't protect the innocent, you will receive the worst possible punishment. But why? Why does he read it this way? There were lots of ways he could have read that verse, and he chose to do that. For one thing, this reading is informed by the way in which Jewish tradition demands that we do not stand idly by the blood of our neighbor. Or in the Talmud's phrasing, whoever can protest against the members of their household and does not is held responsible for their household. But also, I would imagine, for a medieval European Jew like Ibn Ezra living under a monarchy that may or may not be favorable to the Jews on any given day, standing in solidarity with the powerless was an essential communal imperative. It was a norm emanating out of his lived experience. So it has been for us as Jews, since the narrative of our powerlessness under Pharaoh 3,300 years ago through millennia of persecution thereafter. Whether or not we are in power, our nomos and our narrative have always underscored empathizing with those who are not. In this political moment, when we feel at times powerless to make any impact or to preserve the institutions and structures in which we believe, following Ibn Ezra and the Talmud, we must at least try to find some way to protect the vulnerable. And I know that many of us here are engaged in all sorts of ways, specifically at CBE, to do that. And as we do that, as we establish some norms for this time, some ways forward or values to govern our next steps, we can remember one last piece of that narrative that we read, amidst the laws of this parsha. I mentioned it a moment ago, but you might have missed it. That if the widow and orphan are mistreated, God will hear their cry. As we read the laws that emerge from a story of prior degradation, we also cling to a story in which God's self hears the cries of the oppressed and guides them eventually to freedom. Surely there are things that we can do, however small, to enact our Jewish values of protecting the vulnerable. And as we do them, may we continue telling a story, our story, that culminates in freedom. Shabbat Shalom.